možnosti natáčení filmu o mě panem prorokem. Závidím mu jeho jméno. Občas bych taky potřeboval vědět něco dopředu. Častokrát mé předpovědi potvrdily.
Prague Castle, symbol of Czech statehood, seat of kings of Bohemia, and since 1918 of presidents of the Republic. Václav Havel's first election as the head of the Czechoslovak state took place towards the close of the stormy year of 1989, the year that brought an end to more than 40 years of communist rule, not only for Czechoslovakia, but for a Europe divided by the Iron Curtain.
Slibuji vám, že nesklamu vaši důvěru a dovedu tuto zemi ke svobodným volbám.
One of the principal objectives of the new president was to lead his country to its first free elections, restore its democratic traditions, and revive the legacy of Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, the founder of the Free State of Czechs and Slovaks, and their first president. Václav Havel was born in 1936 into the family of a distinguished Prague businessman linked with the Czech intellectual and political circles of Masaryk's Republic. His paternal grandfather was a well-known building contractor. Besides other projects, he built the famous palace named the Lantern in the center of the nation's capital. Havel's uncle Miloš was a prominent patron of the Czech cinema. In the early 30s, he established the Barrandov film studios on the outskirts of Prague. 3 years after the Second World War, the communists seized power in Czechoslovakia. Václav Havel's father became a target of the class struggle against the bourgeoisie, like many other people associated with the pre-war democracy who did not go into exile. The consequences of this class hatred affected his son too. The communist regime prevented him from pursuing higher education. Finding a decent job was difficult as well. Václav Havel took an interest in art, particularly in the theatre and literature, and began to write. He found a kindred spirit in Olga, a girl with a completely different social background. She was later to become his life companion. At the beginning of the 60s, Havel worked in the theatre on the Balustrade, a small but very popular Prague playhouse, first as a technician, later as an assistant director and house dramatist.
Protože je odcizen a protože je svět absurdní a protože jsme všichni jako Sisyfos.
His first play, premiered in 1963, was The Garden Party. a piece portraying absurdity in society. The universality of the sense of the absurd, which was the central feeling of the young playwright, soon brought Havel's plays to prominent world stages as well. Václav Havel himself describes it as follows: "Absurdity is always perceived more clearly by one who stands outside, who is excluded, who does not identify with the routine course of events." At that time he was finally admitted to drama theory studies at the theatre faculty of the Prague Performing Arts Academy. The second half of the 60s brought a certain thaw into society. The effects were also felt in the country's cultural life. A ray of independence came with the Prague Spring of 1968. Artists were amongst the first of those who spoke out. Václav Havel was among them. But the attempt to reform socialism was of short duration. In August of the same year, it was literally crushed by Soviet tanks. In no uncertain terms, Brezhnev's Soviet Union made it clear who was master in the small Central European country that had dared to stray off the course of Marxism-Leninism. The so-called normalization began. Totalitarian injustice, backed by the Soviet occupation, tightened its grip. Many of Havel's friends went into exile. Havel stayed, but he faced a ban on his artistic activities. Ignored by the powers that be at home, he remained an acknowledged author abroad. His plays continued to appear on foreign stages. In seclusion, despite the strict ban, he went on working. His writings of that period were not only literary pieces and essays in which he tried to reflect upon the absurdity of his time, but also texts of a political nature. The latter included an open letter to Gustav Husak, the head of the communist regime, which was a sharp critical analysis of the situation in the Czechoslovak society of the 70s. This criticism represented the first step toward an open domestic opposition that tried in ways permitted by the law to point out violations of basic human rights. Václav Havel considers the role of the dissident as something neither special nor mysterious. He says dissidents are simply people who have decided to say aloud that which most of the others only think, but are afraid to pronounce. In 1975, Havel launched an underground publication series called Expedition. Over 200 forbidden works appeared there. In 1976, he became a co-founder and one of the first spokesmen of Charter 77, a loose association of men and women who signed a document of the same name calling for dialogue on the human rights and liberties recognized throughout the democratic world. Charter 77 showed that even though communist Czechoslovakia had subscribed to these principles in the Helsinki Accords, it refused to observe them. What followed instead of dialogue was harsh repression, persecution by the secret police, interrogations, prison. More than 5.5 years behind bars for Václav Havel. Paradoxically, it was in prison that he found room for reflection upon himself, upon man's responsibility and his self-affirmation. He confided these thoughts to his wife Olga in letters that eventually developed into philosophical essays destined not only for the person who was the mainstay of his life. Havel's imprisonment evoked protests from eminent Western European and American intellectuals. International pressure led to his release from prison. But he remained under constant surveillance. The secret police watched over his apartment on the banks of the Vltava River in Prague, as well as his country home, making their presence quite blatantly obvious. In 1988, President François Mitterrand of France paid a state visit to Prague. He had made it a condition that he should meet also with representatives of the domestic opposition. For the first time ever, the country's communist authorities were forced to admit of its existence. The meeting at the French embassy was conducive to the first officially permitted anti-regime demonstration in Prague in 20 years. The rally was held on the 10th of December to mark Human Rights Day. Václav Havel was one of the main speakers. The participants promised one another to assemble again on that same day the following year. None of them would have foreseen the crowds that were to come to the streets a year later. Society began to take courage, showing ever more openly its disapproval of the totalitarian regime. In January 1989, people clashed with the authorities when demonstrating in commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the death of philosophy student Jan Palach, who had publicly burned himself to death in the center of Prague in 1969 to protest against the Soviet occupation. Once again, Václav Havel went to prison for several months, this time for wanting to lay flowers on the site of Palach's self-immolation. Prague, 17th of November 1989. In an authorized demonstration, students remembered the death of Jan Opletal, a Czech undergraduate killed by the Nazis 50 years before. The mass rally was brought to an end by the brutal intervention of the police on National Avenue. The people, especially the young, refused to remain silent any longer. Students went on strike, and all the country's theatres joined them. Václav Havel emerged among the founders of Civic Forum that sought dialogue with the ruling powers. By that time, however, the communist authorities had lost virtually all public support. Ever more vigorously, people called for an end to 40 years of one-party rule and demanded free elections. Communism in Czechoslovakia was breaking down. Absurdity came full circle when the parliament of that time, still largely communist despite a few hurriedly made replacements, elected a man who until quite recently had been a prisoner of conscience to become president of the country. Václav Havel kept his promise. 1990 was the year of the first free elections. They confirmed that Czechoslovakia was returning to the free and democratic Europe. Freedom and democracy means first and foremost a sense of responsibility. To Václav Havel's mind, this entails an awareness of not only personal responsibility, but a global responsibility as well. The new president spent most of his time with the people. Traveling throughout the country, he saw the effects of 40 years of totalitarian rule, for instance in the northern parts of Bohemia and Moravia, which bore the brunt of environmental devastation. Václav Havel's wife Olga was active as well. She created the Goodwill Committee, a humanitarian foundation which, thanks to Olga Havlova, has won great prestige both at home and abroad, and shown the whole defunct communist world that caring for the disabled and socially deprived is a task for all. President Havel engaged in foreign policy as well, moving rapidly and vigorously to foster his country's economic and political cooperation with the advanced democratic nations, and forging official contacts as well as personal friendships with the leading figures of world politics. He aroused an overwhelming response when making his first official visit to the United States and addressing the US Congress. The Czechoslovak president did not come to America as a petitioner to ask favors for his country. He came as a respected politician who understood the broader impact of the disintegration of the former Soviet Empire. To tell America, the greatest democratic power in the world, you can help us most of all if you help the Soviet Union on its road to democracy. To the Soviet Union, he offered partnership between two sovereign states on a footing of equality. At the same time, he insisted that Soviet troops should be unconditionally withdrawn from Czechoslovak territory. After 22 years, the occupation was over. President Havel called for the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact that lost meaning once the Iron Curtain was gone. A year later, after 36 years of existence, the pact indeed met its end. Czechoslovakia was a federal state of the Czechs and Slovaks. The collapse of totalitarianism created room also for open discussion of the future. There were debates on a new form of statehood. Voices saying that the federation had become antiquated were heard more and more often. Václav Havel tried by political means to prevent the country from splitting. The multi-ethnic Yugoslavia not so far away was a warning. Moreover, the Europe of the 90s was clearly embracing an opposite trend, that of integration. The second democratic elections were held in 1992. Slovak voters opted for forces whose aim was greater independence for Slovakia. Despite all negotiations, dissolution of the federation became inevitable. The matter was to carry it out in a decent and straightforward manner, with respect for the political reality. In the summer of 1992, Václav Havel, a convinced federalist, resigned his office as President of Czechoslovakia. 6 months later, the 74-year-old Czechoslovak state ceased to exist. In January 1993, Václav Havel is elected the first president of the independent Czech Republic. The neighbouring Slovak Republic remains the closest natural partner. It is to Slovakia that Václav Havel makes his first foreign visit as head of the Czech state, to attend the inauguration of his opposite number, Michal Kovács, the first president of the Slovak Republic. The smooth accomplishment of the division of the federation into two new states has found appreciation throughout the democratic world. The main tasks of the Czech Republic are to complete the reforms initiated at the beginning of the 90s, and to proceed with integration into Western European structures. As the highest representative of the country, the President of the Republic plays an irreplaceable role in these endeavours. His background as a philosopher with the soul of a dramatist is an added dimension to his leadership. This makes itself felt in speeches, which Havel delivers at a wide range of forums, both domestic and international. There again, he subscribes to the concept of global responsibility, placing a particular emphasis on the responsibility of those who hold power in the world, not excluding himself. When accepting at Harvard University in the United States one of his many honorary degrees, he highlights the dangers that lie in boundless materialism. He sees an alternative for the future in endowing our civilization with more spirituality, in awakening in politicians a sense of global responsibility for a globally threatened civilization. Václav Havel has strongly condemned the war in the former Yugoslavia, pointing out that it is a conflict of principles and not of peoples. He finds it deplorable that the international community failed to take timely action that could have averted the senseless killing. In his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the Czech Republic's armed forces, he supports the participation of Czech troops in a peace mission in the former Yugoslavia. After the Dayton agreements were concluded, bringing hope for the termination of the war in Bosnia, he was one of the first European statesmen to visit Sarajevo. Two months earlier, at a solemn session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, Václav Havel outlines his vision of the UN of the future. He believes that the only source of a new spirit of global cooperation lies in shifting people's attention from that which makes them different to that which unites them. The United Nations he envisages should not be a group of divided nations and states, as is often the case, but an organization of united citizens of the world. On the domestic political scene, the President wields considerable moral and political influence. The high regard he enjoys among people of different political convictions, together with the fact that his term of office is longer than that of Parliament, serve as safeguards of continuity of the country's democracy. Since the very beginning of his political career, Václav Havel has vowed to be a non-partisan president. This enables him, for example in his often strong exhortations before the House of Deputies, to come forward as an independent politician.
Je duchovní život naší společnosti bohatě protkán úvahami o naší národní téma.
In January 1996, Václav Havel suffered a painful loss. After a protracted illness, his wife Olga passed away. She was the first reader and critic of her husband's literary works, and later of his political writings. For nearly 40 years she stood at his side, patiently enduring a totalitarian oppression. The way in which she undertook charity work after her husband's election to the presidency made her a true first lady of her country, in the best sense of the word. The foundation that bears her name goes on helping those who need to be helped. Both the domestic and foreign press often ask Václav Havel whether he can find time to write a new play while serving as head of state. Regretfully, he replies that he cannot. However, he does not fail to point out that the realm of high politics is giving him a great deal of inspiration, which he hopes to use one day. Altogether, Václav Havel has written 16 plays, many of which are still produced by prominent stages, both in and outside the Czech lands.
Ale to já přece nepopírám.
For the time being, his activity as a writer is limited to writing philosophical essays and pieces related to his political efforts. Every edition of these draws much attention among the reading public as well as translators. Václav Havel, writer, dramatist, philosopher and politician, holder of numerous international awards, state decorations and honours. To his fellow citizens he remains first and foremost a human being of high moral standing.